Hello, Professor Kent Lee here, and in this video we're going to explain more about what the field of linguistics is. Now, linguistics is a social science which is kind of complex like other social sciences like psychology and sociology. It's not enough just to say that linguistics is the study of languages or in language in general. There's more to it than that. We want to understand what are the defining issues of the field, what it's about, what linguists think about, their chief concerns, what drives the research, what drives the theories. And the purpose of this lecture is not to focus on the theory, but to give you a flavor of what the theories are like, because it tells you what the field is about. We're going to look at the history of the field and what some of the current and past theories were about. So we're going to look at the history of linguistics and some of its chief concerns in the past, starting with language history, and then language and culture and mind and structures, and then language acquisition and linguistic theory, modern linguistic theory, and its unique focuses. As an academic study of language, it consists of different approaches and viewpoints, different theories that different people use because they have different concerns and different interests, because it's a complex topic. Nonetheless, we all pretty much have the same assumptions. Whether you belong to this theory or that theory, or you're not terribly theoretical at all, and that's cool, we all have similar assumptions. Descriptivism, descriptive assumptions. It is never right to judge one variety of languages better than the other. Dialects are dialects, including formal varieties. They're all equal in our eyes. Our goal is not to say one is better as a linguist or to impose rules. Our goal, our job, is to describe human language and human languages as people actually use them, as people really speak, be it formal, informal, colloquial, dialectal, whatever. Those are all valid. So because of that, as Chomsky said, the native speaker is always right. His or her intuitions about what one would say in the language, at least her own variety of the language, that's correct because it represents their grammar and their set of rules. Even if they can't articulate the specific rules, they can give judgments about whether this makes sense, whether you can say in English, curious green ideas sleep furiously, for example. Dialects and varieties are just as valid for study as the standard language. And the standard language is just one that's been arbitrarily elevated to a standard status. So we don't evaluate, we don't judge, we study. And we're interested in describing and analyzing language as people actually use it. Well, to think about what is linguistics, we could ask, how would you study language? How would you approach it? Here's your lab, study it. Well, what would you do? What would you focus on? Well, there's so many things to focus on, and that, depending on your interest, that would affect the kind of methods you use for your research or your studies. So some people would approach it as a set of rules to pick apart and analyze that are just in the mind. And along with that, assumptions that it's a logical system of structures and words and meaning. In addition to that, some would take a more cognitive and psychological approach. And language came out. The language ability in the human mind and brain obviously evolved from other psychological abilities or other aspects of human psychology, and some take a more cognitive approach and use more psychological research tools to study it. Some take a more theoretical approach, and they sit at their computers and or ask people, hey, is this a good sentence in the language? And they analyze it. Some treat language as more of a social phenomenon for communication and understanding, and they focus on that using rather different research methods. Some are just interested in teaching or learning, and they take a rather different approach, multiple approaches. A lot of these are informed by some kind of theoretical understanding of linguistics, and we'll first need to talk about theories. We're going to talk a little bit about linguistic theories that drive the field, and they kind of define what the field is about today. So we need to talk about what the word theory means in academic English, science and social sciences, and humanities too. A lot of people misunderstand this because the word theory in academic English has a different meaning than in colloquial English. In colloquial English, people might say, my theory is that my English teacher is an alien because he's really strange. Well, that's more like a conjecture, a guess, or a hypothesis. That's not what it means in academic English, especially science. A lot of people think, well, a theory means something that's not been proven true yet. If it were proven true, it would be called a law. That is totally not true. We cannot reject something just because it's a theory. There are theories in different academic fields. Humanities, for example, there's literary theory, different theories in philosophy. There's general literary theory, and there's more specific literary theories for specific types of issues in literature. In social sciences, there are many. In psychology, there's attachment theory about how children need to form an attachment, emotional bond with the caregiver early in life, and if they don't, they will have relationship difficulties later in life. That's been proven, by the way. There's game theory, a theory of human decision-making in competitive situations. There's good evidence for that. In science, there are a lot of theories in science. Evolution, general relativity, special relativity, germ theory, gravitational theory. A theory does not mean it's not proven. There are theories that have been proven, and we still call them theories. For example, the theory of evolution. That has been proven true. You can look up information online if you are skeptical. There's not only proof from fossils, but especially from DNA, genetics. A law is something really different. So when Sir Isaac Newton came out with his law of gravity, some people didn't believe him and they criticized him. Why? Well, he had pretty good, I think, mathematical and empirical evidence for it, but people said, okay, what causes this gravity thing? Newton had no explanation for what causes it. He didn't have a theory. A theory is an explanation. It was not until Einstein came along with his theory of relativity that we finally had the beginnings of a gravitational theory, a theory at least on a cosmic scale that explains what gravity is and how it's related to other things in the universe. Theory of evolution, for example, it's a complex set of statements. Living organisms come from, more complex living organisms come from simpler ones. Changes arise through genetic mutation. Mutation is misunderstood. It means change in Latin. I have blue eyes. That's a genetic mutation. It arose in Europe 10,000 years ago due to a lack of coloration in the iris. It's a mutation. People thought it was sexy, and we had children, and here I am today. Mutations could be good, bad, neutral. But then there's natural selection of certain traits which get passed down to their offspring. Natural selection is misunderstood. It's not survival of the fittest. Darwin and other biologists never said they never said survival of the fittest. That's not a proper biology term, by the way. The term survival of the fittest was coined by a sociologist in the late 1800s who was very pro-capitalist and used that as an argument for social Darwinism and cutthroat capitalism, which has nothing to do with biological Darwinism. And it's not just Darwin, but since Darwin's time we've added to the theory, we've added parts about genetics, and there have been some other things added too in recent decades. What's the purpose of this? It's designed to explain the diversity of life forms. Darwin was amazed by the diversity and similarity of different life forms and species in his travels, and the theory is designed to explain that. It explains the diversity and variety of life forms on this planet. Does not explain where life first came from. That's a different issue, but once you have life, evolution explains what happens with it. A theory is an explanatory framework then. It's a set of propositions or principles or ideas or statements, and some of those statements could be laws, but altogether these statements form a coherent conceptual framework, a coherent explanation of some phenomenon. Germ theory explains infectious diseases. Relativity explains the relationship between space-time, matter, energy. A law, in contrast, is a very simple statement that is generally or usually true. Newton's law of gravity is generally true in the normal universe, not in relativistic situations like black holes, but in the normal world. The law of gravity holds. Laws of motion also. In economics, the law of supply and demand. There's a relationship between price, supply, and demand. Under normal circumstances, it generally holds true. A law is a simple statement. A theory is a more complex statement. It is higher than a law. And many theories are true. They've been proven true. So the theory of evolution, it is a complex framework that explains the variety of life forms. In humanities, there are theories like literary theory, general literary theory that explains how to interpret literature. Then you have specific theories for specific issues in literature, gender theory for gender issues in literature, cross-cultural theory for cultural issues, and so on. In the social sciences are full of all kinds of theories, and linguistics is no exception. Now in humanities, a theory is often accepted on pragmatic reasons. It just works for us. This theory of literature, it works. It generates new analyses and insights, gives us new insights into literature and the relationship between authors and literature and readers. In sciences, theories have to be empirically verified first before we accept them. It has to go through a lot of rigorous testing. And in social sciences, it kind of depends. Some linguistic theories may be treated more as, well, we'll accept it because it works. And then some people debate and argue and says, no, you need some more empirical proof than that. You need more scientific proof. But linguistics has a number of theories, lots of theories. And we'll get into the current or modern day theories in a little bit. But first, we need to look at the history of linguistics and some of the defining issues in the past and the defining issues of today. So let's look at some of the historical stages and important issues. Before linguistics came about as a social science, it kind of started to come together as its own thing in the 1800s. Before that, what we had was maybe philology, which is informal study of language, maybe for literary purposes or for purposes of teaching and learning languages, or looking at words and word histories and words among different languages, and study of grammar too was kind of a thing. Some people did some good work in grammar. In Europe is mostly grammar studies, writing grammar books for the purposes of teaching and learning languages, often prescriptive grammars. In the East, there's some interesting work. In the ancient language of Sanskrit of India, some interesting grammatical work was done by scholars such as Panini. Their religious scriptures were written in Sanskrit, and they felt an obligation to memorize these scriptures, so they needed to understand the language better to memorize their scriptures. They analyzed the complex grammar of Sanskrit. Sanskrit, for example, has complex word blending phenomena, like in English, don't you becomes don't you. Sanskrit had a lot of that, with the sounds and the syntax and the morphology. Later, Chinese scholars did some study of the Chinese language, particularly the phonology and the tone system. So later, when King Sejong and his court scholars developed the Korean Hangul alphabet, they actually weren't operating in a vacuum. They had access to the scholarly works from the Indian grammarians and the Chinese, and that informed the development of Engl. Another line of work was philosophical semantics, study of word meanings for philosophical purposes. And it was important for a couple of reasons. One, if you're constructing logical arguments like A, blah, 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 B, therefore, blah, 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 therefore, C, Socrates is a man. Well, what is it about the assumptions and the truth conditions and the meaning of the sentences and the meanings of the words that lead you to the conclusion that Socrates is a man, not a horse? Those were important issues for philosophers. Or if you say, oh, Kierkegaard, the famous philosopher, was a bachelor, what does it mean to say bachelor? Is there any possible world or reality where a bachelor could be married? No. Law of contradiction. By definition, a bachelor is an unmarried man. Well, okay, how about the Pope? He's not married. Is he a bachelor? It's a good question. So they debated these kinds of issues, and that provided the basis for linguistic semantics. We start to enter the development of linguistics when William Jones comes along. He's a British scholar, late 1700s, who lived and studied in India, learned Sanskrit and other Indian languages. And by this time we knew that Latin and Greek and Western European languages, many of them were related. There were a lot of word similarities and sound similarities. So many languages with something like, where mater is mother and pater is father, for example, or some words based on those. But he came into contact with Sanskrit, and he realized Sanskrit was just like Latin and Greek. The grammar was very similar, just more complicated, and there's so many related words between Sanskrit and Latin and Greek. And then the modern languages of India were from Sanskrit, just like the Romance languages, French, Italian, Spanish, were from Latin. So this started a lot of work by him and other scholars in the 1800s into language history and language relationships, and they found that a lot of languages stretching from Europe all the way to India were in the same family. They were related, what we call Indo-European languages, including languages of Iran, Farsi, Pashto, Dari in Afghanistan, Pakistan, languages of India. These were all related. There are fairly systematic similarities in words and sound structure. If you look at a lot of basic words in these languages. And they realized that these languages must have come from some common ancestor, just like French, Italian, Spanish came from Latin. Well, these Indo-European languages must have come from some ancestor language several thousand years ago, called Proto-Indo-European. It also includes, Albanian and Armenian and a few others. And then people got started identifying other language families, the Uralic language families in Eurasia, and Sino-Tibetan languages like Chinese, Semitic languages of the Middle East, and so on. So a lot of work was done comparing languages and language relationships in the 1800s, and sometimes these people are called neo-grammarians. And they started to kind of like the linguistic, somewhat formal study of language and language relationships. Then along comes the 20th century, and what we had before was not really, there wasn't any real theory yet. We start to get somewhat of a theory. And a theory, is something that's nice, gives coherence to the field of study, gives it some direction. What are we doing? What's the goal of our field? Structuralism is maybe the first attempt to do so, and it kind of evolved out of a couple of different things. It's often defined or attributed to Ferdinand de Saussure, the Swiss linguist in the early 20th century, and he made several kind of theoretical contributions to the field, some of which I'm not going into here, but one interesting one was this example I gave earlier. Bottle, well, it's a linguistic sign which consists of the signifier, the word bottle, made up of several sounds strung together, and the signify, the thing that it represents, which is this thing. Thirsty. Arbitrariness of signs. Discrete units that can be combined in arbitrary but regular ways and systematic ways. Sounds into words, but also words into grammatical phrases. So it's not just words, but then grammatical phrases. The bottle's on the table, the bottle's full of water. In other languages, these are expressed in very different ways. In English, like the adjective noun, followed by preposition and another noun. Languages have a lot of ways of doing these structures that are very different. For example, East Asian languages oftentimes put the preposition after. So instead of the bottle is on the table, the table on is, for example, and that's those are different kinds of structures that exist in different languages. Adjectives can come before or after nouns. Articles can come before or after nouns, or may not exist at all in the language. These are arbitrary phrases. Different languages can do things different ways, however they like. The grammatical structures are somewhat arbitrary and very varied among languages. The language of Georgian in ex-Soviet Georgia and the Caucasus does some, and related languages do some interesting things. For example, a direct object like I hit the car, it's grammatically marked in the same way. The object of a verb is marked in the same way as the subject of an intransitive verb, like the car disappeared. The car, same grammatical markers as I hit the car. There's a good reason for that. It's kind of abstract though, which you can find out later in a linguistics course. Along this, and about the same time, anthropologists were going out and not only describing new unknown cultures, but new unknown languages. So there was a lot of work with anthropological linguistics. They did what's called ethnographic research, ethno meaning people, so they would go to a new people group and they would study the people group, the people ethnographic, through observational studies and interviews. And they also developed ways of learning their language and finding out about the structure of their languages through these field research methods. So they collected a lot of data about a lot of different languages in the world, and some linguists became interested in various tendencies and what structures were more common in, or what kinds of tendencies and relationships were more common in languages of the world. So this was the structuralist period, and they kind of figured out how the basics of how phonology works and sentence grammar works, really basic stuff, the basic components of sentence grammar in a more refined, proper way. Around this time, though, because of the anthropological work, an interest in relationship between language and culture, there arose a particular theory called linguistic relativism and linguistic determinism. The second one is often known as the Sapirwhorf hypothesis, and it's kind of controversial. If you remember the movie Arrival, it's a great movie. You should go see it. It refers to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It's kind of based on it, really. Do you think that learning an alien language would fundamentally alter your perception of time and how time works? That's the basis of the movie. Well, I don't think so. It's a great movie, though, but it's an interesting idea. That would really involve rewiring your brain at a fundamental level in a way that just learning a language couldn't do. Because the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the strong version, or linguistic determinism, claims, and it's really not just a hypothesis, it became more of a theory, it claims that your language, the language that you know, basically shapes or limits or allows for what you can perceive, how you perceive the world. So the way you perceive the world is maybe limited by your language or made possible by what your language can express. What your language can express kind of defines how you see the world. The weaker version of this linguistic relativity is more reasonable. It just claims that there's a relationship between language and culture, so that your language might shape or might influence. Influence is a better word. It might influence the way you see the world sometimes, but it doesn't really shape or determine it. But the Sapirwhorf hypothesis, the strong version, became pretty popular. Sapir was a linguistic anthropologist who developed the theory, but it was promoted a lot by Whorf. Whorf, however, was not a properly trained linguist, and he didn't quite know what he was doing. And we'll come to a prime example of that in a minute. Common example of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is, well, different cultures have variations in their color terms. If you look at basic color terms in the language, there's some variation. So basic word, what we call a basic word, a basic term, would be a common everyday word. A word, it's a simple word, it's not a compound. It's a word that primarily refers to that thing. In this case, we're talking about color, so its primary meaning is a color, not something else. It's a word you would learn as a child. So in English, maybe 10 or 12 words: red, green, blue, orange. You could quibble about orange because it's also a fruit, but I think today it's more commonly a color. Black, white, gray, and such. So silver is the name of a metal that wouldn't really count, and such. Some languages have one basic word for blue and green, not unusual. Russian has two distinct words for, well, not only just separate words for blue and green, but two distinct words for light blue and dark blue. Basic, common, everyday words for light blue and dark blue. Does that really alter your perception of colors? If my language has one word for blue and green, does that mean I can't distinguish between the two colors? Of course I can. I can use specialized terms because my language, unlike Russian, does not distinguish between light blue and dark blue. Does it mean that in English I can't distinguish those colors? That's silly. I just did. I used compound expressions or derived expressions or specialized expressions. Light blue, dark blue, baby blue, ocean blue, sea blue, royal blue, midnight blue, aqua blue, etc. Whorf came, another example might be kinship terms. So in English, we just have like one word for aunt and one word for uncle. So we just think of an aunt as an aunt and an uncle as an uncle, whether it's from your mother's or your father's side of the family, and whether the person is a sibling of your mother or father or an in-law, relative by in-law. But in some languages, there are clear distinctions between an aunt or an uncle who is an in-law or a blood relative, or who is on your mother's side or your father's side. And I think that can probably affect your perception of kinships to some degree. I noticed this, and my wife and I were talking about, oh, well, it's not really your uncle, it's an in-law. Well, it's my uncle, you know. Her perception is kind of different. So yeah, it could influence your perceptions, but not necessarily in a really fundamental way, I think. Now, Whorf made this particular claim that's gotten very famous. He made the claim that Eskimos have many words for snow, more than 10, more than 30 words for snow, because snow and cold weather are such important parts of their culture and daily lives. Therefore, they have many words for snow. They have words for snow that's half melted, dirty snow, snow that comes down in light powder, packed powder, etc., etc. the fact that they have a lot of snow-related words is not interesting. If you're a graphic designer, you know a lot of color terms. If you're a typographer, you know a lot of typography terms. If you raise dogs as a hobby, you know a lot of dog terms. If you're a biologist, you know lots of biology terms. So to say that they have a lot of snow-related terms is not interesting. It's kind of mundane. Worf didn't know what he was looking at when he looked at data about their language, and he saw like snow-related words. Sometimes they were like complex expressions, even like whole phrases and sentences, and thought that was a snow word, and it wasn't. Or, for example, snow used as a building material for igloos, and he assumed that was a snow word. That's nonsense. So, today nobody believes in that. There are a few people who still work on the idea of linguistic relativity, that maybe language and culture and your perception of the world influence each other, but that's kind of really hard to pin down. Not a lot of people are really still interested in this issue. A few people still study it, but it's not really a big driving issue anymore because the field moved on. But just some more examples of the problems of the Sapirwhorf hypothesis. We can claim, well, some languages don't have past tense markers like Chinese, but they can perceive the past tense just as well as we do. In the 80s, a Sapirwhorfian linguist, a white guy, made the claim that from his study that Chinese people can't perceive counterfactuals as well as we do. So a past factual conditional would be like if he went, then he bought it. A counterfactual or contrary to fact conditional would be if I had known that, hypothetical, I would have, so past hypothetical. So this guy made the claim that Chinese people can't conceptualize past counterfactuals because Chinese grammar doesn't express it distinctly from past factual conditionals. Well, when he gave a talk, in the audience was sitting a Chinese researcher who was very offended by this. She's basically hearing a white guy say that Chinese people are kind of dumb. So she went out and did some research, psychology research, and proved him wrong. They can perceive of past counterfactuals just as well as we can, even though their grammar doesn't express it differently. So this was the structuralism era, and it kind of lasted up until the 1960s, and it started to be replaced by something else. A guy named Noam Chomsky came along and started a big revolution in linguistics. But before I talk about Chomsky and his ideas, I need to go back into another strand of the history, the psychology, and how psychology and linguistics kind of influenced each other, particularly parallels between linguistics and psychology and how psychology influenced linguistics. So let's go back to Sigmund Freud. Some people call him Sigmund Freud. Well, you know, some of his ideas were rejected very soundly. His ideas about sexuality were rejected. He did make some lasting contributions. He pioneered the use of therapy, talk therapy, psychotherapy, and also his idea about the subconscious mind, that there's this world inside us that we can't consciously access, this intrapersonal and emotional world that we don't know it's there. We don't know what's going on in there, the subconscious mind. We can't consciously access it, but it affects us because a lot of stuff goes on in there. And that's an interesting and key observation that still holds. But in reaction to maybe some of the excesses of Freud came behaviorism, and it started with John Watson. And this has to do, it starts with kind of the old debate between nature and nurture, which had gone on since ancient times. The way you are, your personality, your intellectual abilities, is it by nature? Is it something you're just born with and that's it? Or is it all nurture? Is it a product of environment and upbringing and your environment and culture? The behaviorists took a strong nurture view, and Watson said, you know, give me a child and with any kind of input, I can make a child turn out any way I want to. And you know, Pavlov, The next guy is B.F. Skinner, who promoted a particularly strong version of behaviorism and became really dominant in the US in the mid-20th century. Some of you, probably many of you, if you took foreign language classes, might have suffered under techniques based on Skinner's or behavioristic ideas. If you ever took a language class and it involved a lot of drilling and repetition, maybe dictation, repeating after the teacher, repeating all together as a class, grammar, drills, and such repetitive work and memorization, that's an influence of behaviorism. Particular language teaching method called the audiolingual method that arose in the 1930s based on behavioristic ideas. The field of psychology was largely dominated by behaviorism, and it kind of put the study of cognition off limits because it focused on behavior, response, and conditioning. There were a few niche areas where you could do cognitive work, though. One was child cognitive development, thanks to the French psychologist Jean Piaget and his theory of child cognitive development. So there was this one safe haven where you could do some work with studying cognition, what goes on in the mind, if you're doing child development. In the rest of psychology, especially North America, it was behaviorism, and studying cognition, what goes on in the brain, was not really considered cool. Another kind of niche area that was safe from behaviorism was Gestalt psychology, which started in the 40s in Europe, the German word for form or shape. So they focused on, in terms of therapy, they focused on treating the whole person, a holistic approach, and understanding the whole person, their emotions and their thinking and behavior. But they also did interesting work in perception and cognition. It's thanks to them that we see these optical illusions like the face-vase illusion, because it depending on which color you focus on affects your perception of the whole thing, whether it's a vase or two faces. A couple of other things kind of interesting, put a bunch of dots in a row and it happens to look like a continuous shape just because they are together. Or you have some dots over here and some dots over here and there's a gap. It's just the fact these are put together and these are put together and there's a gap here. It makes them look like two different objects. These look like one object because it's a bunch of dots that are just close together, and this gap makes these two things look like different objects. And that is an idea that becomes relevant later in a particular theory of linguistics later on. Behaviorism was really king, especially in the US. Skinner's radical behaviorism basically says that the brain is a black box. In comes a stimulus or input, and out comes your response, your output, and you study the stimulus and the response and the conditioning that happens as a result. It's all about conditioning. What happens in the black box, in the mind, Skinner said that's not psychology, that's not scientific, it's like magical stuff like consciousness and cognition, and he said that wasn't really for scientific study. That's speculative, and philosophers can worry about that, or theologians can worry about that. He said, what happens in here is not psychology. We just study the stimulus and the response and the conditioning. That's your behaviorism. It really limited what psychologists could really research and do. And I took a course from one famous psychology professor when I was in grad school, and he said that he described behaviorism as the dark ages of psychology. It was a very anti-cognitive theory. They were against studying cognition. They dismissed it as not an object of scientific study. In 1957, Skinner tried to apply his theories to explaining how children learn their first language. He wrote a book called Verbal Behavior to explain child language learning, and he basically tried to explain it as stimulus response, as conditioning. Children learn their language by conditioning and repetition. And that was it. That's how children learn language. this behavioristic learning. In 1957, there was a young PhD student named Noam Chomsky who wrote a review of Skinner and published it in an academic journal. And Chomsky tore Skinner apart. It was a very well-written review that just totally destroyed Skinner's ideas. I highly recommend that you read it if you're interested in linguistics. And he argued that first, language learning is too complex for a child to learn just by conditioning. There's a lot going on in there, and one problem is what's called the poverty of the stimulus. Children don't get enough information to be able to say what they say based on just input, direct input, because they say a lot of novel things. They'll say really creative things. They'll say all kinds of new sentences that they never heard before, but they can say them. And they don't make certain mistakes that you might expect them to. And they make some mistakes, but what they are doing, even the mistakes that they make, shows that what they are doing is they are learning rules of the language. Although subconsciously, and you can't talk to a child about grammar and teach the child grammar. Try correcting a child's grammar and the child will have no idea why you're correcting her. They can't think consciously about abstract stuff like grammar, but they're doing it subconsciously. It's the subconscious again. It's going on subconsciously. They learn the language subconsciously through exposure, input, and social interaction with their world. They are learning the rules. They start out with like one-word utterances and then go to two-word utterances like doggy go, kitty bad, and things like that. Then they start to form simple sentences. And then complex sentences. They learn the things like verb endings, and if that exists in the language, they learn the grammar forms. And sometimes they make mistakes in a way that shows that they are doing rule learning, learning rules. At a certain point, sorry, mosquito. At a certain point, they will start to say things like this. My son is about 5 right now, and he says things like, I catched it. And I'm not going to correct him, but I'll rephrase it. Oh, you caught it. He'll say, yeah, I caught it. A minute later, he'll say, I catched it. Or I bide it. Bought, bide. They have learned the past tense rule, or they figured it out. ED is past tense, and they are over applying it. They're applying it to every verb. Then later they realize, oh, there's this separate category of irregular verbs, irregular past tenses, and they'll correct themselves. You don't have to, no problem. They'll figure it out. But this shows systematic rule learning. And it's something that behaviorism cannot explain. They're learning rules and they are applying them to produce a lot of novel new utterances that cannot be explained by just input and conditioning. And this was a critical takedown of behaviorism that really changed the field of linguistics and psychology. So in psychology, by the 80s, people had rejected behaviorism and had moved on to things like cognitive psychology, the study of cognitive psychology. And it wasn't just because of Chomsky, but that was one factor. So 3 major factors in what's called the cognitive revolution in psychology. Abandoning behaviorism and taking up the study of cognition, what happens in the black box in the mind, perception, cognition, thinking, language, etc. One was Chomsky's criticisms of behaviorism. Another was findings from neuroscience and how the brain works that stimulated new interest in issues in cognition in psychology. So those factors, the neuroscience findings and just a new interest in looking at questions of cognition and perception drove the cognitive revolution. By the time Skinner died, he was apparently a bitter, angry young man, or old man, and he denounced the world of cognitive psychology as creationism. He really did that. You can look at his last talk on YouTube before he died. Another thing that Chomsky posited was that there's this critical period. Within about the first 10 or 12 years of life, that's a crucial time for children to learn language. And almost all children do. They need to be exposed to a language in order to learn it naturally. Yes, you can learn a language later as an adult, like a second language, but you have to learn some language first as a child. And if you don't learn any language as a child, you can't effectively learn language after that. That's the critical period. This critical period ends around the age of puberty, when the child's brain undergoes significant changes. And if you don't learn a first language as a child, you can't really learn it as an adult. The evidence for this, the naturalness of learning a first language, how learning a second language is quite different. Once you learn a first language, you can learn 2 first languages as a child. The terminology is weird. So first language just means a language, even if it's 2 languages, like my son is bilingual, Korean and English, before the critical period. But if you learn a language or 2 languages as a child, you can learn another language as an adult when you're older, but it's different. It works differently. You learn your first language in a thoroughly subconscious way. You never thought about grammar. It was subconscious and natural. Learning a second language takes more conscious, intensive effort, probably some kind of formal instruction, or at least conscious learning and teaching of patterns or rules of the language or principles of the language. And you can become fluent in a second language as an adult, but it's different, and it's a bit harder. Other evidence for the critical period, well, deaf children, if they don't learn to sign, sign language is a natural language, just like any human language, like German or French. It's a language. It has its very own syntax and equivalence of phonology and morphology. It's a full-fledged language. If they don't learn to sign when they are children, then it's harder for them to learn to sign in a very natural way. The signing is kind of more, it's different, it's not as fluent, it's a little more awkward. There's a famous case where some deaf children at an orphanage in Nicaragua, I think in the 70s or 80s, developed their own sign language. And the younger children who learned it were fully fluent in the sign language. The kids who learned it when they were a bit older weren't quite as fluent in the language. Deaf children or children born to deaf parents who don't get enough language input have language impairments later in life, or who don't get enough linguistic interaction as children too. There have been a few cases of children deprived of language and social interaction as children. Some of these are horrific cases of abuse. There's a famous case of a girl called Jeannie, who was discovered in the 1960s in California. She had been kept tied up in a closet for the first 12 or 13 years of her life before she was discovered. Her parents were kind of psychotic and abused her a great deal. It's a really horrible story. When she was found, after she was found, some linguists tried to teach her English. She could learn words, but not really grammar. And she never became really fluent at speaking English, or even very proficient. And there are other critical period effects too. So biologists fully accept the idea of critical period. It's not controversial in biology. Attachment, I mentioned that earlier. A child in the first 3 years of her life needs to attach emotionally, bond emotionally with a caregiver, a parent. And if she doesn't, then later in life she will have some problems with social relationships. And there's about 3 different kinds of attachment disorders, particular problems with close relationships that the child will have. It can be dealt with therapy or treatment, but it takes work. And it's hard to overcome. Maybe not I don't know if it can be completely overcome. There are critical period effects in other domains, and this is true for pretty much higher mammals in general. Visual cognition, if a mammal is deprived of any visual input in the first few weeks of its life, we know of this from studies with cats a long time ago. Once the animal is able to open its eyes and see the world, well, it can see things, but it can't really recognize and distinguish objects. It can't learn object recognition. There's nothing wrong with the eyes, it's how the brain interprets data from the eyes. The brain never learned how to interpret the data or recognize objects. And it's essentially sort of a seeing blindness. It's a sight blindness. Can't recognize things. Mammals have a critical period for vestibular balance. The vestibulum, part of the cochlea in the ear, which controls your balance. If you don't get exposure to gravity or balance your first, few weeks or months of life, at least in mammals in general, can't develop a sense of balance. So critical period is not really controversial in biology. There is some argument or debate about the finer details of the critical period, especially for learning a second language when you're older and how that works. There's debate about how it works, but generally the critical period itself, especially for first language, is pretty well established. So let's talk about the generative linguistic revolution of the 1960s, the generative linguistics or Chomsky linguistics, because that defines a lot of the important issues that drive the field today. Even those who are not theoretical linguists or not generative linguists, they're still influenced in some ways, maybe by, in terms of what is it about the generative linguistics that they like, or what is it that they don't like, what is it that they are rejecting. The different approaches can be defined really in relation to how different they are from generative linguistics. So, generative linguistics posits that there's an abstract structure to languages and to language. A lot of the rules that govern how we say things in the language are probably rules that we can't consciously access. They're kind of more internal psychological rules that are abstract, and they work mostly subconsciously. But they really affect the structure of different languages and how languages are different from another. But all in all, there's a uniform set of principles that really undergird all of the possible structures of all the languages in the world. And we can use the same toolbox to analyze many different languages. There's no one language that is just really alien or really weird that can't be analyzed with the same toolbox that we use for other languages. And this in turn will explain someday, hopefully, language acquisition, how especially children learn their first language and how they use these abstract principles of language to learn their first language. We talk about abstract structure. Let's see an example. Take a sentence like, John is eager to please, and a sentence like, John is easy to please. Maybe pause the video and take a minute to think about this. Are they structurally the same? Do they have the same grammatical structure? On the surface, it looks like they do, but they don't. So pause and come back. Okay. John is eager to please. Who's doing the pleasing? John. Who is being pleased? Well, it's not specified, so it's kind of a generic someone or anyone that's not expressed. So it's like John is the invisible subject of please. John is easy to please. What's the subject of please? Well, anyone. It's generic and it's thus not expressed. It's an invisible subject. Anyone or anybody. Who is being pleased? John. It is easy to please John. You could say that. These look the same on the surface, but there's a deeper level of meaning and representation where they are actually different structurally. even though they look the same at the surface level. At a deeper level, at a deep level, it's called. They are different. They have different structures. And Chomsky and his band of merry syntacticians in the 60s and 70s started looking at sentences like these and inferring the abstract principles that relate maybe how sentences and structures and how they're related to each other. Particularly in the early days, a lot of movements of transformation were proposed to explain this kind of abstract thing. So if you see a tree structure like this, that kind of it's not important for you to understand all the technical details of tree structures, syntactic tree diagrams, and how they work right now. And it's not necessarily true that this is how the brain processes language, but this is some kind of a representation for what generativists think is happening when you are producing a sentence like this. John is, at some level, the subject of please. But then John moves over to the subject position before is eager. So there's this movement, a transformation to explain this kind of abstract or deep structure. And so this is called transformational grammar, and it was known by this in the early days in the 60s and 70s. John is easy to please. John starts out somewhere else in the sentence at a deeper level of kind of abstract representation. Then he moves over to the subject position of the main clause, is easy. So there's this movement of this transformation. And over the years, Chomsky kind of had to simplify this because at first there were like so many transformations proposed and it was excessive. And the theory went through changes in evolution in terms of the specific machinery for the syntax, that is. And this has always been somewhat controversial. It's been argued, okay, what happens really in the mind? Do we really do transformations in the mind, or is there some better way of representing this? And that's an issue of debate among linguists, which we won't get into. But this is how Chomsky proposed dealing with this, as well as things like passive transformations. John was hit by a bike is a transformation. It was proposed of an active sentence, a bike hit John. Things like that. And interestingly, you can think of possible interpretations of other sentences that could be ambiguous. Climbing plants can be terrible. How do you interpret that? Plants that climb, like vines, or does it mean climbing a plant, like climbing a giant beanstalk plant, for example? Time flies. Well, usually that means time passes quickly. Flies is a verb, but you can think of other interpretations. I'm timing flies with a stopwatch, like flies buzzing around the room. Oh, that one's really fast. And each of those interpretations would have a different underlying or deep structure, a different representation that would explain them. That's sort of how generative grammar works. And it uses abstract rules and abstract representations, and many varieties of generative grammar rely on some kind of transformations or movement or derivations, as they're called. So generative grammar, generative linguistics relies on the following assumptions. We try to come up with rules that generate the language, and by that, what we really mean is not some kind of a factory production kind of generate. That's often misunderstood. Generate in the mathematical sense, meaning to explain, describe, fully account for. So we want to find those abstract rules of the grammar that would fully explain and account for any sentence that a native speaker of a language could possibly say, and any sentence that a native speaker could meaningfully understand and say that makes sense, that's possible to say that in my language. And of course the approach is descriptive because we study the grammars of whatever variety of a language and accept that as a grammar that is totally valid and acceptable. We believe, generatives believe in the universality of languages, that they all have the same kind of principles or parameters that lead to the different rules. So a parameter is like this. Imagine a machine with different parameters. You can turn switches and go this way or that way. Not to make language too mechanical, but it's like you can have like adjective noun, red balloon, or balloon red in some languages. So for noun phrases at this level, you can switch them this way or this way. And then if you have determiners or quantifiers like the or each, the balloon, balloon, the, you can switch them in different ways and do this enough for all other structures and levels of phrases, and how you combine sentences, like I know what you did last summer, or two sentences combined into a more complex sentence. Are all kinds of parameters, and you can set them this way or that way, and this one can go this way or that way, and that gives you probably thousands or millions of possible grammars, and each language will have some combination of parameter settings for like how you do noun phrases this way or like this, or verb phrases like this or like this, and so on. So those are parameters, the settings that a particular grammar can choose from. These are the possibilities for, say, noun phrases at this level. We can choose this or that. Another assumption that Chomsky made is performance versus competence. Competence is, for example, as a native speaker, I have a certain competence. I have my knowledge of the grammar of my language, my variety of my language. That's my mental competence. And that's what linguists primarily want to study, at least in the generative school. We could make sometimes performance errors. That's performance. I could be sick, I could be tired, something could be loading my working memory, and I can make mistakes. That's performance. And to Chomsky and generativists, that wasn't as interesting. That's maybe interesting for other people to study, but just in order to be able to scientifically study the competence, we want to isolate that from the performance. Some people kind of objected to that because they felt Chomsky was saying that the performance wasn't important. It's just that to the generativists, the competence is maybe what they want to study first. We need to really master this, and then performance is another kind of issue that others can look at. So, the paradigm, that is the parts of generative linguistics theory. So again, it's generative. We take a generative approach. If you're a generative linguist, you're trying to find the rules, the abstract rules that will generate or explain all of the grammar of the language and all possible things that one could say in that language as a native speaker. There's the idea of universal grammar, that this grammar and its possible settings are universal to all human beings and to all languages. All languages are in the same human family. They all develop language ability, developed in humans, evolved in humans about the time or before the time that humans started to spread throughout the globe. So all human languages have the same kind of toolbox. There's no language that is just really alien or underdeveloped structurally. They're all universally describable with the methods and tools of a linguist. These rules and parameters are abstract, and we have to maybe look at how people use the language, maybe collect data in order to find out what these rules are, because they're abstract, and many times you can't just ask a native speaker why. You can ask native speakers, does this sound right? Or can you say this? Does this make sense to you in the language? But the native speaker usually can't explain these abstract rules that would tell you why it is. It's also an important tenet of generative linguistics that children are born with, in some way, they're born with sort of a knowledge of the universal grammar. They're born with a knowledge of what is possible in a human language, and when they are born and they start hearing a language around them, like English, then their brain picks up on it and it turns on these parameter switches that they're born with, say, okay, it's like this and like this and like this. And that is supposedly how children learn language. And so according to generative linguistics and according to Chomsky, it's important, one, to discover all these abstract rules of human languages and the parameters of these rules, and then to explain how children acquire language. How do children use knowledge of these rules or parameters, this knowledge that they're born with of what's possible, to figure out the language. So this idea that children access universal grammar to learn a language, it's still somewhat controversial. It's kind of a difficult theory to really prove empirically, but it's quite interesting whether you agree with it or not. So this provides maybe a general explanation for how children learn language, but we want to really know the details of how they access the universal grammar and how they're using it as they learn the different parts of the grammar of their first language. And another question is, if you're learning a second language later, are you able to access all of your universal grammar to learn a second language? And that's kind of a separate issue. In terms of child language learning, also children are subject to a critical period. They have to learn a language, some kind of language, any human language. One, we can learn 2 languages as a child naturally this way, but they have to do it within the critical period. Before puberty, after that, their brain can't really learn language effectively anymore, at least not grammar. So this defines a lot of important issues in the field. Child language learning. Well, some people study child language learning and how children learn language. Maybe by referring to universal grammar or generative theory, maybe not. But it made that generative linguistics made that an important issue. For some people, also studying acquisition of sign languages and Pidgin and Creole languages is important. For a lot of people, applying this to L2. Okay, to what degree can you apply generative theory to learning in L2? For those interested in teaching and learning languages, or those who just want to study the process of adults or older people, teenagers, adults learning a second language, they might ask, to what degree does this universal grammar apply? To what degree can they use it? Or maybe instead they prefer to use some other kind of theory for studying second language learning. But nonetheless, this is an important issue in the field too, second language learning. For some people, they like to take theoretical approaches to studying linguistics, and they focus on these abstract rules, looking at grammar and syntax and looking for universal patterns and tendencies and structures across languages or within a particular language, trying to explain in theoretical terms first language acquisition, and working on all the theoretical explanations and details. There are generative theories. Chomsky's theory has kind of evolved over the decades from the early days of so-called transformational grammar with lots and lots of transformations, and they tried to get away from that excess, and the theory got kind of, the transformations were kind of pared down over the decades, and new theoretical insights and developments from other researchers were incorporated into the Chomskyan syntactic theory, government binding theory, principles and parameters, and then the minimalist program, where all the transformations were kind of minimalized and such. And so that's a particular form of generative linguistics that focuses on a very mechanical approach, a lot of abstract structure and transformations to explain the syntax. There are others who like the general generative approach. They say, we don't like the transformations. We like everything else, but we don't like the transformations, and we want to find a different way of doing this, different way of explaining the structure. And so there are alternative approaches within generative linguistics. Quite in contrast to that is functionalism, and these are people who largely reject a lot of Chomsky's ideas. They're still descriptivist, of course, but they're more they don't really believe in, or they're not really interested in deep abstract structure. They are interested in the surface structure, and they are interested in language as a communication tool, social communication, and the communicative function of different structures of language. And while personally I feel it seems like an incomplete theory of grammar, it does have its advantages because it is useful for people in language teaching and language education, which is one area where it finds some very nice application. Cognitive linguistics is a different approach. It says some of them may or may not agree with some elements of generative theory, but they're more like, hey, language evolved from other abilities and processes in the mind. Let's base our theory of grammar and meaning on psychology and psychological processes, psychological abilities. And that's a very interesting field, I think. Cognitive linguistics, cognitive grammar, that it turns to psychology as a basis for particular theories of grammar and meaning. And they do probably more empirical research. Connectionism, an approach to studying language that's based on neural networks and how the brain works and how neurons work. We'll talk about that later. And there are, kind of like functionalism, there are theories of pragmatics, communication and context, and theories of social interaction, sociolinguistics, that are not interested in the abstract stuff that Chomsky and his followers are into. They're more interested in language communication and maybe teaching. And then there are theories of second language acquisition that may accept or reject different parts of Chomskyan theory also. So, what is linguistics? It's a social science. It's about analyzing the structure of human language in general and human languages, understanding and studying and understanding and analyzing language structures for different purposes. Maybe for understanding human cognition, maybe for teaching purposes, for understanding how children learn language. So linguistics can be more theoretical, it can be more empirical or data-driven or even very scientific in its approaches. Linguistics, for some people, can be more cognitive, more psychological. For others, it could be more social and communicative. In their approach and their theories will be maybe more social, communicative, maybe more practical. Some are more theoretical, some are more practical. And finally, there are a lot of people who are interested in language acquisition. First, language acquisition among children. Second, language acquisition among older people past the age of puberty. And language education, learning and teaching. Some of them may be more theoretical. A lot of them may be more practical in their approaches to studying this because they're interested in teaching and education. So that's basically what linguistics is. It's a complex social science, and it studies the variety and the diversity of human language in all of its complexity from many different aspects and many different angles, but with a lot of focus on issues that were defined going back to the 1960s. So that is linguistics. That's what linguistics is. And I might answer some of your questions later through some follow-up videos. But for now, I'll see you later. Thank you.